October 27th, 1962, a single Soviet submarine commander held his finger over a nuclear trigger. His two fellow officers screamed at him to fire. One word from him, and World War III begins. This actually happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just another Cold War standoff. It was the moment when two superpowers played chicken with nuclear weapons, and neither one blinked until the very last second. For 13 days in October 1962, American and Soviet forces stood at DEFCON 2, one step away from total war. School children practiced hiding under desks. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards. And behind closed doors, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev exchanged messages that would decide whether civilization would see another sunrise. The crisis didn't start in October. It started months earlier with a betrayal that the United States never saw coming. Cuba sits just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, close enough to see from Key West on a clear day. For decades, it had been America's playground, a tropical paradise where American companies owned the sugar plantations, the hotels, the casinos. Then in 1959, Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries seized power. They threw out the American-backed dictator Batista and promised to return Cuba to the Cuban people. At first, the United States tried to work with Castro, but Castro had other plans. He nationalized American property. He cozied up to the Soviet Union. And in April 1961, President Kennedy approved a CIA plan to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro using Cuban exiles. The invasion happened at a place called the Bay of Pigs, and it was a complete disaster. The exiles were captured or killed. Kennedy was humiliated, and Castro was now absolutely certain that America wanted him dead. He wasn't wrong. The CIA launched Operation Mongoose, a covert program designed to assassinate Castro and destabilize Cuba. They tried everything: poisoned cigars, exploding seashells. They even tried to get the mafia involved. Nothing worked. But Castro knew they were coming for him, and he needed protection. So he turned to the Soviets. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, saw an opportunity. America had placed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, right on the Soviet border. Those missiles could reach Moscow in minutes. Khrushchev wanted leverage. He wanted the Americans to know how it felt to have nuclear weapons pointed at their homeland. And he wanted to protect his new ally in Cuba. In the summer of 1962, Khrushchev made a decision that would bring the world to the edge of destruction. He would secretly send nuclear missiles to Cuba. The operation was called Anadyr, named after a river in Siberia to confuse American intelligence. Soviet ships began making voyages across the Atlantic, carrying not just conventional weapons, but medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles. These weren't small weapons. These were nuclear missiles capable of hitting Washington, D.C., New York, and almost every major city in the eastern United States. The warheads were powerful enough to kill millions in a single strike. The Soviets went to extreme lengths to hide what they were doing. Troops were told they were going to a cold region, so they were issued winter gear, even though they were heading to tropical Cuba. The missiles were transported at night. They were covered with tarps. Soviet personnel were forbidden from speaking about the operation. Khrushchev believed he could get the missiles operational before the Americans noticed. Once they were armed and ready, he would reveal them to the world, and Kennedy would have no choice but to accept their presence. But Khrushchev made a critical miscalculation. He underestimated American intelligence. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane took off from McCoy Air Force Base in Florida. Its mission was routine surveillance over Cuba. The pilot flew at 70,000 feet, high above Cuban airspace, snapping photographs with powerful cameras. When the film was developed the next day, analysts at the CIA couldn't believe what they were seeing. There, in the Cuban countryside near San Cristobal, were unmistakable signs of Soviet missile installations, launch pads, missile transporters, support vehicles. The analysts compared the images to known Soviet missile sites in the USSR. It was a perfect match. The Soviets were installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, and they were almost ready to fire. On the morning of October 16th, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy walked into President Kennedy's bedroom and told him the news. Kennedy was still in his pajamas. The president stared at the photographs, his face growing pale. He knew immediately what this meant. If those missiles became operational, the Soviet Union would have the ability to launch a nuclear first strike against the United States with virtually no warning. American missile defense systems were designed to detect launches from the Soviet Union, giving the country at least 15 minutes of warning. Missiles from Cuba would hit their targets in less than 5 minutes. There would be no time to respond, no time to evacuate, no time to retaliate before American cities were turned to ash. Kennedy assembled a group of advisors that would become known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. For the next 13 days, this group would meet in secret, debating how to respond to the crisis. Every option on the table carried enormous risk. Some advisors pushed for an immediate military strike. General Curtis LeMay, the cigar-chomping Chief of Staff of the Air Force, was the most vocal advocate for military action. LeMay argued that the United States should launch a massive airstrike to destroy the missile sites before they became operational. He called it a surgical strike, but everyone in the room knew it would mean war. Soviet troops were stationed at those missile sites. An airstrike would kill Russians, and once you start killing Russians, there's no telling where it stops. Others worried that an airstrike wouldn't be enough. The Air Force couldn't guarantee they would destroy all the missiles. If even one missile survived, it could be launched in retaliation, killing millions of Americans. Some advisors argued for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Send in the Marines. Overthrow Castro. Eliminate the threat permanently. But an invasion would take time to organize, and it would definitely trigger a Soviet response, possibly in Berlin or Turkey. Then there was the option of doing nothing. Some argued that the United States already lived under the threat of Soviet nuclear missiles. The Soviets had intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach America from the USSR. Did it really matter if they also had missiles in Cuba? Kennedy rejected this argument immediately. Allowing the Soviets to place missiles in Cuba would be seen as a sign of weakness. It would embolden Khrushchev to take more aggressive actions elsewhere, and politically, Kennedy couldn't survive it. Republicans were already accusing him of being soft on communism after the Bay of Pigs disaster. If he allowed Soviet missiles in Cuba, his presidency would be over. Kennedy chose a middle path, a naval blockade. The U.S. Navy would create a ring around Cuba and prevent any more Soviet ships from delivering missiles or military equipment. Kennedy called it a quarantine instead of a blockade because a blockade is technically an act of war, and he wanted to avoid using that language. But make no mistake, it was a blockade. Any Soviet ship that tried to cross the line would be stopped, boarded, and searched. If they refused, they would be fired upon. On the evening of October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation on television. 70 million Americans tuned in to watch. Kennedy's voice was calm but firm as he explained the situation. Soviet missiles had been discovered in Cuba. They were offensive weapons capable of striking the United States. This was unacceptable. The United States was implementing a naval quarantine, and any Soviet ship carrying offensive weapons would be turned back. Kennedy demanded that the Soviets dismantle the missile sites and remove the weapons from Cuba. If they didn't, there would be consequences. Kennedy's speech sent shockwaves around the world. Stock markets crashed. People rushed to grocery stores to stock up on supplies. In Europe, citizens braced for war, knowing that if the superpowers went to battle, their continent would be the battlefield. In the Soviet Union, Khrushchev was furious. He saw the blockade as an act of aggression, an illegal violation of Cuba's sovereignty. He ordered Soviet ships to continue toward Cuba. He sent a message to Kennedy warning that Soviet submarines would sink any American ship that tried to stop them. The world was now on a collision course toward nuclear war. The first test came on October 24th. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. American destroyers moved to intercept them. On the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, fighter jets were armed and ready to launch. In the Pentagon, military commanders watched radar screens, waiting to see if the Soviet ships would stop or keep coming. The tension was unbearable. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously whispered to Bundy, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. At the last moment, the Soviet ship stopped. They turned around. Khrushchev had decided not to challenge the blockade directly. It was a small victory for Kennedy, but the crisis was far from over. The missiles were still in Cuba. Satellite images showed that construction was continuing. The launch sites were becoming operational. American intelligence estimated that some of the missiles could be ready to fire within days. Kennedy increased the pressure. He ordered low-level reconnaissance flights over Cuba, sending jets screaming over the missile sites at treetop level to gather more detailed intelligence. He mobilized troops in Florida, preparing for a possible invasion. More than 100,000 soldiers, Marines, and paratroopers assembled at military bases. An invasion fleet gathered off the coast. The message to Khrushchev was clear. If you don't remove the missiles, we're coming in. But Khrushchev was facing his own pressures. Hardliners in the Kremlin were pushing him to stand firm. Soviet military commanders in Cuba were urging him to make the missiles operational as quickly as possible. And Fidel Castro was practically begging the Soviets to launch a nuclear first strike against the United States if America invaded Cuba. Castro was ready to turn his island into a radioactive wasteland if it meant taking America down with him. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Khrushchev began secretly communicating through back channels. Khrushchev sent a long, rambling letter to Kennedy on October 26th. The letter was emotional, almost desperate. Khrushchev compared the crisis to a rope with a knot in the middle. Both leaders were pulling on the rope, and the knot was getting tighter and tighter. Soon, he wrote, the knot would be so tight that no one could untie it, and the only solution would be to cut the rope. And cutting the rope meant war. Khrushchev proposed a deal. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States promised never to invade Cuba. Kennedy and his advisors saw this as a possible way out. But before they could respond, a second letter arrived from Khrushchev on October 27th. This letter was different. It was formal, written in official language, clearly drafted by hardliners in the Kremlin. Khrushchev now demanded that the United States remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for removing Soviet missiles from Cuba. This was a problem. Kennedy had already been planning to remove the missiles from Turkey because they were obsolete, but he couldn't be seen as making that deal under pressure. It would look like the Soviets had forced him to back down. It would damage America's credibility with its NATO allies. XCOM was divided on how to respond. Then, everything got worse. October 27th, 1962. Black Saturday. The day the world almost ended. That morning, a U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson took off for another reconnaissance mission over Cuba. Anderson was an experienced pilot, a veteran of the Korean War. But as he flew over eastern Cuba, a Soviet surface-to-air missile battery tracked him. The local Soviet commander, without authorization from Moscow, gave the order to fire. The missile streaked into the sky and exploded near Anderson's plane. The U-2 disintegrated. Anderson was killed instantly. He became the only direct casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Kennedy learned that an American pilot had been shot down, the room went silent. This changed everything. The military was demanding retaliation. General LeMay wanted to launch airstrikes immediately. Other advisors argued that if they didn't respond to Anderson's death, it would signal weakness. But Kennedy held firm. He didn't want to escalate. Not yet. He knew that one wrong move could start a war that would kill hundreds of millions of people. But the worst moment of the crisis was still to come, and it was happening underwater, far from Washington and Moscow. 4 Soviet submarines had been deployed to escort the ships carrying missiles to Cuba. These weren't ordinary submarines. They were Foxtrot-class diesel-electric subs, and each one carried a nuclear torpedo. Not a conventional torpedo, a nuclear torpedo. Each torpedo had a 10-kiloton warhead, roughly 2/3 the power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The submarine captains had been given permission to use these nuclear torpedoes if they believed they were under attack and couldn't communicate with Moscow. One of these submarines was B-59, commanded by Captain Valentin Savitsky. For days, B-59 had been submerged in the Caribbean, trying to avoid American destroyers. But the Americans had detected the submarine and were tracking it. U.S. Navy destroyers began dropping practice depth charges, small explosives designed to signal the submarine to surface. The Americans thought they were just sending a message. They didn't know the submarine was carrying nuclear weapons. Inside B-59, conditions were nightmarish. The submarine had been submerged for days. The air conditioning had failed. The temperature inside was over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were dangerously high. Crew members were passing out. The batteries were nearly dead. And now, explosions were going off all around them. Captain Savitsky believed they were under attack. He couldn't communicate with Moscow. He didn't know if war had already started. He assumed the worst, and he decided to use the nuclear torpedo. "We're going to blast them now," Savitsky shouted. "We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the shame of the fleet." 2 officers were required to authorize the launch. Savitsky and the political officer both agreed. But there was a 3rd officer on board, Vasily Arkhipov. He was the flotilla commander, and his approval was also needed. Savitsky and the political officer argued with Arkhipov, screaming at him to authorize the launch. The heat was unbearable. The crew was dying. American destroyers were right above them. Arkhipov refused. He convinced Savitsky to surface instead. B-59 surfaced in the middle of the American fleet. U.S. sailors watched in shock as the Soviet submarine appeared, its crew stumbling onto the deck, gasping for air. The Americans didn't fire. They let the submarine go. B-59 returned to the Soviet Union. The world never knew how close it had come to nuclear war until decades later when the story was finally declassified. If Arkhipov had said yes, if he had authorized the launch of that nuclear torpedo, everything would have changed. The Americans would have responded. The Soviets would have assumed war had started. Missiles would have launched from Cuba. The United States would have retaliated. Within hours, nuclear weapons would have been flying across the globe. Vasily Arkhipov, a man whose name most people have never heard, saved the world. Back in Washington, Kennedy still didn't know about the submarine incident. He was focused on finding a way out of the crisis before it spiraled completely out of control. His brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. Robert Kennedy delivered a message. The United States would agree to remove the missiles from Turkey, but it had to be done quietly, months later, so it didn't look like a trade. Publicly, the deal would be that the Soviets remove missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. promises not to invade. Privately, the Turkish missiles would be dismantled. Khrushchev had 24 hours to accept the deal, or the United States would invade Cuba. Khrushchev took the deal. On the morning of October 28th, Radio Moscow broadcast an announcement. The Soviet Union would dismantle the missile sites in Cuba and return the weapons to the Soviet Union. In exchange, the United States pledged not to invade Cuba. The crisis was over. People around the world breathed a sigh of relief. In the United States, Kennedy was hailed as a hero who had stood up to the Soviets and forced them to back down. In the Soviet Union, Khrushchev was criticized by hardliners for appearing weak, and 2 years later, he was removed from power. But both leaders knew the truth. They had come terrifyingly close to destroying everything, and they had pulled back just in time. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed the world. It led to the installation of a direct communication line between Washington and Moscow, the famous Red Telephone Hotline, so that future crises could be managed before they spiraled out of control. It led to new arms control negotiations. Both superpowers realized that nuclear brinkmanship was a game no one could win. But the crisis also revealed something darker. It showed that even rational leaders with all the information and all the advisors in the world could be pushed to the brink of a decision that would end civilization. It showed that nuclear war could start not because of evil or madness, but because of miscalculation, misunderstanding, and fear. Decades later, historians and researchers uncovered just how close the world came to annihilation. The story of Vasily Arkhipov and submarine B-59 wasn't revealed until the 1990s. When former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara learned about it, he said, "We came within a hair's breadth of nuclear war without even knowing it." The Cuban Missile Crisis was 13 days when the world held its breath. It was the moment when humanity looked into the abyss and decided to step back. We survived because of luck, because of level-headed leaders, and because of people like Arkhipov who refused to push the button when everyone around them was screaming to do it. Today, nuclear weapons still exist, thousands of them. The tensions between nuclear powers haven't disappeared, and the lessons of October 1962 are more relevant than ever. The next crisis might not end the way this one did. The next Arkhipov might not be there to say no. If this video opened your eyes, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story.